Buce Strowini. That, by the way, is how you say hello everyone in Upper Sorbian. Now, in our last installment, we looked at some of the historical events, specifically in the Holy Roman Empire, that are going to help us understand the political and religious situations in the Lusatians in the middle of the 19th century. Today, let's take a deeper look at the situation in Lusatia and in Prussia. Now, if you remember from our discussion in the second installment, Lower Lusatia is mostly in the modern-day German state of Brandenburg. But in the middle of the 19th century, when the Wends begin immigrating, it is part of Prussia, and Brandenburg is as well. And if you look on a modern-day map, you're not going to find Prussia at all because it ceases to exist in the aftermath of the Second World War. What happens over time is that Prussia gradually grows from being a not-so-important duchy at the time of the Reformation to becoming the driving force behind the German Empire in the late 1800s. And all of this interplay between Brandenburg and Prussia is important because it helps us understand how things got to be the way that they were in the 1800s for the Wends in Lower Lusatia. Now, let's take a quick look at a map of Brandenburg and Prussia in the 17th century. At the time of the Reformation, the Lusatias are part of the lands of the Bohemian Crown, if you remember, and that's south of the area that this map shows. Brandenburg exists as the Margraviate of Brandenburg, and it's over here in the orange. And the green areas off to the side represent territorial acquisitions and growth over time. Now, in Brandenburg, like in Saxony to the south, the ruler is an elector, so he gets to cast a vote when the time comes to elect a new Holy Roman Empire. And Prussia is over here to the right of the map in the pink, and it is divided from Brandenburg by the Kingdom of Poland. And what is important is Prussia is outside of the Holy Roman Empire. We'll come back to that. Brandenburg officially becomes Lutheran in 1539, and the population has remained heavily Lutheran ever since. However, in the early 1600s, the elector of Brandenburg, Johan Sigismund, privately converts to Calvinism, and then in 1613 he publicly takes communion according to the Calvinist rite. Now, Sigismund wants all of his subjects to follow suit and also become Calvinist, but a number of them have no intention of doing that. And unfortunately for poor Sigismund, one of those people who has no intention of doing that is his own wife, Anna of Prussia, who remains Lutheran and even takes the side of the Lutheran in the dispute that ensues. So, poor Sigismund has to give up on his idea, and he ends up with two state churches in Brandenburg. There is a Calvinist or Reformed state church and a Lutheran state church in his realm. Well, a few years later, in 1618, Sigismund's father-in-law, the Duke of Prussia, dies. And at that point, Sigismund also becomes the Duke of Prussia in addition to being Elector of Brandenburg. And so for the next few hundred years, this combined territory of Brandenburg-Prussia is ruled by the same family. But this creates an interesting situation because if you remember, Prussia is not part of the Holy Roman Empire, but Brandenburg is. Well, 1618 also happens to be the same year that the 30 Years' War kicks off in the Holy Roman Empire. And as we discussed previously, the Lusatias get awarded to Saxony in 1635 when it ends its participation in that war. Well, in 1700, Sigismund's great-grandson, Frederick III of Prussia, takes advantage of the political situation in Europe, which includes the gradual decline of the Holy Roman Empire that sort of begins with the 30 Years' War, and he elevates Prussia's status to that of a kingdom. And he is crowned Frederick I, king in Prussia in January of 1701. But remember, Prussia is not part of the Holy Roman Empire, and Brandenburg is. Well, in the Holy Roman Empire, legally, there are only two people who can call themselves king. There's the emperor himself, who is also the king of the Romans, and then there's this odd exception that's been carved out for the king of Bohemia. And that's why Frederick I is crowned king in Prussia, even though he also rules Brandenburg, because technically he's not king there. But for all intents and purposes, Brandenburg is administered as part of the Kingdom of Prussia, and it actually is economically the most important part of the Kingdom of Prussia. Well, through all of this, that problem of having both the Reformed and Lutheran state church in the realm continues to be a thorn in the side of the rulers, and nobody is able to solve that. But that changes in 1797. Friedrich Wilhelm III, the great-great-grandson of Frederick I, becomes king. He's determined to change that. And the next year he makes his first move, and he decrees that the government is going to produce a combined uniform agenda that can be used for worship in both Reformed and Lutheran congregations. Well, progress on this is somewhat slow because between 1801 and 1815, Prussia is distracted during the Napoleonic Wars, just a wee bit. And it's at the conclusion of these wars, if you remember, that Lower Lusatia is taken from Saxony and awarded to Prussia. So at that point, Friedrich Wilhelm's plans for unifying the churches with this agenda become the problem of the Lutheran wins in Lower Lusatia as well. Well, by 1817, when the 300th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation rolls around, that new worship agenda isn't complete. But still, Friedrich Wilhelm takes this opportunity to advance his plan, and he announces that the Garrison Reformed congregation in Potsdam and the Lutheran congregation are going to merge into a single union congregation that's going to celebrate the Reformation together. And he also suggests very politely that he'd like all of the Lutheran and Reformed churches in his realm to do the same thing. Well, some of them will do that, but there are others who are unwilling to accept what's going to become known as the Evangelical Church in the Royal Prussian lands, what we usually call the Prussian Union. A few years later, in 1821, that new union agenda is finally completed, and in the following year, all the congregations in Prussia are directed to begin using it. It actually becomes illegal to use older agendas. However, it seems like there's something in it for everybody to dislike, because in order to create something that both Lutheran and Reformed Christians can use, it's necessary to pull from both traditions. Now, during this process, Friedrich Wilhelm III becomes very involved, and he also becomes something of an expert on liturgies, and he actually ends up drawing very, very heavily from Lutheran agendas, and even from Luther himself, because despite the furor that what he's doing is going to cause, he actually wants to do something that he feels is good for the churches in his realm. He doesn't see why there can't be fellowship between Lutherans and Reformed Christians. But of course, he also has to pull from Reformed sources to do this, and in the end, he has something that some people find to be too Lutheran and some think are not Lutheran enough. And one big problem is with the part that deals with communion. In order to be acceptable both to Reformed and Lutheran Christians, it's necessary to use vague language for that part of the service. But for traditional Lutherans who believe that they received the true body and blood of Christ within and under the elements, the Reformed idea that communion is more of a spiritual reception of the body and blood of Christ is fundamentally incompatible with what they believe, and that communion portion of the agenda has to back off on that explicit claim that the person receiving the elements receives the true body and blood of Christ. Well, as the years pass, Friedrich Wilhelm III tries various combinations of compromise and force to bring everybody into line with his desires. But the Lutheran dissenters, who become known as Old Lutherans, continue to resist. They continue to secretly utilize the Old Lutheran agenda. And by the mid-1830s, the Old Lutheran pastors who continue to do this are actually being suspended from the ministry and imprisoned. The government is harassing parishioners that seek out these pastors and this sort of thing. So it's starting to get pretty ugly. Well, Friedrich Wilhelm III dies in 1840, and his son Friedrich Wilhelm IV becomes king. And he realizes it's not going to be possible to unify the Reformed and Lutheran Christians as his father had hoped. So he starts to roll back some of the things that his father has done. He releases pastors from prison. He allows the formation of independent congregations that are outside of government control for the most part, though they do have some restrictions, like they can't use bells, they can't have steeples, and things like that. Well, this, of course, is a breath of fresh air for the old Lutherans, and there are a lot of independent congregations that are formed, but they still remain deeply suspicious of the government after this and begin to consider immigration. Because, after all, who's to say that the next guy who comes along and who is king isn't going to start to re-implement the reforms that Friedrich Wilhelm III tried to do? Well, that's all for now. Tomorrow we're going to head back south into the Kingdom of Saxony and see how the situation of the Lutherans there with their Catholic ruler differed from that of their Lutheran brothers and sisters to the north in Prussia.